Welcome to the NNJR Trackside Classroom series on YouTube. My name is Bill Gilbert. I'm one of the Northern New Jersey Region Chief Instructors. And today we're going to be talking about advanced braking tips. I'm going to share with you 6 tips that can improve your braking on track. And I hope you find, a way here to apply at least 1 or 2 of these that help you be both quicker and safer on track. So with all that said, let's dive right in. The first thing, as always, is our disclaimer that this is the best advice we know how to put out there, but when we go to the track, we all know that we take a risk. So with that said, here's what we're going to talk about. Going to briefly talk about priorities. In other words, where does braking fit in? We're going to dissect braking and look at the pieces. And then we'll go through the 6 tips that I'll explain as we go through. And I'll point out that, as you get better, and that's why this is an advanced class, not one for beginners. As we get better, braking is kind of how we get, that last, whether you call it 5%, 2%, 10%, but if we have the rest of it figured out, then we got to work on the braking, as Ross Bentley points out. And in that regard, if you're a beginner, you know that you focus on the line, and that's because that is the most important part of getting around the track safely and quickly. Once we know the line, we have to focus on what Skip Barber calls corner exit car control, which really means exiting the corner in most cases quickly and safely. And to do that, we optimize where we put our foot on the floor, the wide open throttle point, or watt. That's the most important one, but related to that, of course, is where do we put our foot first on the gas pedal, the throttle application point. If we don't have steps 1 and 2 figured out, we shouldn't be focusing on braking. We should be focusing on the line if that isn't right. And if that's right, then we should focus on where can we get our foot on the floor exiting the corner. Only after that's set do we really want to focus on optimizing our braking. Of course, we have to have the braking at some level, but I'm talking about making it a lot better, which is what we're going to be focused on today. So with that said, let's dive into braking. Let's start by talking about the whole series of steps that we go through as we enter a corner. Obviously, our foot's on the floor on the straightaway. And at some point, we're going to move our foot from the gas to the brake. And when we do that, we're going to decelerate or slow in a straight line. And as again, Ross Bentley points out, 2/3 of the braking's in the first third of the brake zone, or at least that's how we want to think about it. We want to use, as soon as we get on the brakes, if we're talking about a heavy brake zone, we want to get as much braking done as quickly as possible. And if you look at the comments at the bottom from Gunnar Jeanette, something very similar. First third of the brake zone, our focus is on, our priority is on slowing. In the second third, we're thinking about our downshift. Yes, we're still on the brakes, but we've already slowed the car down a lot. Now we're focused on the downshifts. And the last third, we want to focus on the brake release. And so if we go back to these 4 steps here, we get our foot off the gas onto the brakes, we brake hard, and then at some point we're going to turn in, and in most corners, our foot's still going to be on the brake, not nearly as much, but still be on the brake. And then at some point, we're going to take our foot off the brake, and either with a delay or not, which is a whole interesting other discussion we could have, we're going to go back to the gas pedal. But we need to kind of optimize all these steps. So let's kind of go through that. Here's a heavy braking example using turn 1 at Watkins Glen, but I could have used turn 1 at almost any track, VIR, Lightning, pick whatever one you want, Summit Point. So our beginning of brake point is, at some point on the straightaway, we've decided, okay, I'm going to take my foot off the gas and I'm going to put it on the brakes. Well, in the past, we've referred to that as the beginning of braking, Bob, but we really want to think about it as an accelerate to point. In other words, until that point, in this example, the 400 marker, my foot's on the floor. If I'm the driver, my foot is planted on the gas pedal on the floor. And why do I emphasize that? If we can move this ahead, they need to be the same, but oftentimes they aren't the same. And here's a way to look at that and an example where they are not the same. If you look at a speed graph for longitudinal G's and you kind of look at the top here that I've circled, you'll see that there's a period of time before the car starts to slow as fast as it could and should. And so what's going on? Well, let's look at the throttle and brake in this example. You can see at the top of the throttle trace here, that same, sloped line that doesn't, I mean, it should go down straight, right? But it's not, it's going down to the slope. And here you can see, that in this case, I've gone from, foot on the floor to 90% gas, for 55 feet. So I wasn't carrying as much speed. And if we look at the actual numbers or time, if you want to think about it that way, that, from the point where I completely got off the gas to where I was on the brake pedal, I was only 35 feet. And it took me only 40 feet, to go from this 90% point to getting my foot on the brake. So in other words, it was a long time in the scheme of things in a brake zone. And I'm picking on myself here because this is my data, but there are many drivers who, if we looked at the data, would show us similar. So that's why we talk about the accelerate to point. So moving ahead in the brake zone, now we've got our foot on the brake, right? Earlier, our foot was on the floor. Now we've moved our foot to the brake. So we're starting with that initial brake pressure at the bottom of the brake pressure graph here. And as we get further in the brake zone, obviously now we're on the brakes hard and we're doing that, do as much slowing as possible in a straight line. As we get further in, we're not ready to turn yet, but we have to get ready to turn. So, we are going to have to taper off the brake pressure. And by the way, there's other reasons as well, which I'm not going to take the time to go into, but there are physical reasons why the brake pressure has to decline as we slow down. And when we get to the turn-in point, now our brake pressure is lower yet, as we begin to, if you will, trail off the brakes to an end of braking point somewhere prior to the apex. So those are the steps that we should be able, if we have data, to look at. But even if we don't have data, we can be aware of how much brake pressure we're using. How much of our right leg are we using on the brake pedal? And in a heavy brake zone, we want to think, if we're thinking about 0 to 10, a 0 to 10 scale, we want to think about stopping at 9 or 9.5. Once we get our foot on the and that applies obviously to a heavy brake zone like a turn 1 at Watkins Glen or VIR or other places. So we're going to start at 9s, and then as you saw earlier on the graph, that's going to drop down so that we're in this example, say at 2.5 by the time we turn in. So even if you're not looking at data, when you're on, or even if you have data you can look at later, when you're on the track, you can calibrate your own thinking using this kind of a scale. Now, of course, in a fast corner, the braking's going to be very different. We're not going to brake at a 9. We might brake at a 3 or even a 2 initially. And then, we're going to do most of that braking in a straight line, and we're going to be almost off the brakes, maybe even completely off the brakes by the time we turn in. And again, we can calibrate that. Are we braking at a 3? Are we braking at a 2? Are we braking at a 5? Just depends on the corner. Are we going to turn in at a 1? Are we going to turn in at a 3? You can calibrate your own experience using this kind of a scale. Now, talking about going back to that heavy brake zone, we talked earlier, tip number 1 was, we're going to keep our right foot planted until we move it as quickly as we can to the brake pedal. Well, when we do get it on the brake pedal, yes, we need to press and feel some resistance, but then we really need to press hard. And I've been shocked in fact, at how hard it's possible to use the brakes in the modern cars. And so I described the proper technique as a 1-2, where the 1 is we get our foot quickly on the on the brake pedal, we press on it, and then we really press on it. And why do I say that? Well, here's an example with again from turn 1 at Watkins Glen, where you see 2 different brake pressure graphs overlaid on each other from 2 different laps, and notice they both kind of end up at the same place, trailing off at almost the same place. But in the one case, I was on the brakes later, but much harder, 1100 psi versus 850. And the car still slowed a lot with the 850. It was not exactly lollygagging, but the difference when I really applied that right leg and hit that 2, to emphasize, is, that much more force. So, if you have a modern car, especially a GT car, likelihood is, you need that strong right leg. Next, let's talk about trail braking. And of course, this is, many people think, kind of where the magic happens, and we'll talk about that. But let's just start with how much trail brake are we going to do? Well, that's really the question you have to answer for your car and your driving style for each particular corner. And and you have to decide what works for you. There is no magic here other than some general rules that we'll talk about. So you're going to need to experiment with how much pressure for how long and see what works for you and your car, how it's set up, how it works with your driving style. Now, there are some general rules. The longer the corner, the slower the corner, the more trail brake there's going to be. The faster the corner, the less there's going to be. If there's camber and or elevation, those are going to affect the amount. And a mid-engine car may need a little less trail brake. Again, depends, but as a general rule, to kind of get your creative juices going, these are things to think about. Now, common mistakes. The most common mistake I see is too much trail, by which I mean too much brake at turn in. Instead of turning in at a 2 or a 3, turning in at a 5. And many times when people do that, they also carry that trail brake too far, maybe even past the apex. But the most common is just literally too much pressure at turn in. So be aware of how much pressure you're using at turn in, and make sure you're not making that particular mistake. So let's look at some specific tracks and talk about the characteristics of some of the corners you probably know. If you know Watkins Glen, you know there's no slow corners. It's a high-speed track, which means there's some heavy brake zones. Turn 1, we've already talked about. The bus stop, turn 8. So we're going to be using the brakes hard in those corners. we're going to be trail braking. Setting aside turn one, we could have a whole different discussion there, but probably some. But certainly in turn six, the laces, very long corner, we're going to be trailing probably quite a ways. Turn eight, the heel, again, a sharp corner, far more than 90 degrees. Same thing with turn nine. And even in the bus stop, for different reasons, we're gonna trail a certain amount. And again, how much, that's going to depend on you and your car, and you need to experiment and figure out how much is the right amount for you. And of course, elevation, helps and hurts. Turn six, the elevation is working against us. The laces. Turn seven, the toe, the elevation is helping us. And we have fast corners like turns 10 and 11, where very little, trail brake, especially for turn 10, is needed. And we probably want some gentle braking to avoid upsetting the car, and or if we are going to hit the brakes harder, say you really go booking into 11, then you're going to want to do that. Maybe you're going to brake at a 5, let's say in a fast car. Well, you're definitely going to want to do that in a straight line. You're not going to want to carry that into a fast corner like 11 and upset the car. So that's Watkins Glen. Let's talk briefly about lightning. Heavy brake zones at turns 1 and 7. We trail into 1, we trail into 2 on a light brake. We trail into 5. We trail into the light bulb. The elevation helps us at the light bulb in turn 1. Turn 7 is sort of a special case, and this is where the camber and the track layout really affects how much trail braking we're going to do, because yes, it's a heavy brake zone, but we want to do most of our braking, if not virtually all of it, in a straight line because of the favorable camber prior to the apex and the unfavorable camber after. Let's talk about VIR. Heavy brake zones at turn 1, at turn 4, and at turn 13 at the end of the back straight. Trail braking, lots of examples. Turn 1 is a very, very long corner. And so we're going to trail, what seems like forever in turn 1 in most cars. Turn 4, very sharp corner. In most cars, we're going to want a fair bit of trail, and we have to you have to help the car turn as much as possible. It's a sharp, slow corner. So we're going to use the trail to help us there. We're going to use trail braking through 11 and 12, all of Oak Tree, again, to help the car turn in a slow corner. And we're going to trail into turn 13 at the end of the back straight, although we really, aren't thinking of it so much about helping the car turn. It's just we're turning, it's almost part of the straightaway, but we probably do use the car to help turn some into 14. Of course, the elevation helps us a lot in turn 13. If that were flat, it would require a ton more brake than it does, since we have that nice hill. And the same is true at going into turn 11, the first half of Oak Tree. We have that nice rise. And so yes, we brake there at a fair effort, but it would be a lot more if that rise weren't there. And we have fast corners to deal with. Turn 3, and especially turn 10, less trail brake, maybe, not much at all, especially in 10. And we're going to do most of our braking in a straight line. This is kind of general. Again, you're going to figure out what works for you and your car. So my next tip is, we're thinking about trail braking. Well, where do we come off the brakes? And where we come off turns out to be much more important than where we get on the brakes, because we can get on the brakes a bit early and modulate that last half of the brake zone, or we can get on them later and be right on the ragged edge all the way through the brake zone. But regardless, we want to come off at the same point, and we have to learn what that end of braking point is. It should be a critical reference point that you have for each corner. And if you're not focused on that, then the first step is to think about how much brake pressure do I have at turn in? Am I turning in at a 2? Am I turning in at a 4? And make that consistent. And then be aware of how you're modulating to come off, how you're releasing the brakes, and experiment with where you do that so that it becomes consistent. And my last tip is really all about this whole phase, and that is that, you know, to get better, we want to experiment with different timing and rates of brake release. Maybe one time we almost jump off the brake pedal and we see what that causes. Another time we come off as absolutely slowly as we possibly can, and we see what the difference is. So pick 1 or 2 corners and experiment with things like that, and then write down what you learn and ask yourself if they make sense. And as Ross Bentley says, he spends more time coaching drivers on brake release than anything else, and I can certainly relate to that. I think most of us can. There's a lot of magic here if we can figure it out properly. And related to that is really my last tip, which is rotation, which really applies to slower and medium speed corners, where if we get just the right combination of entry speed, trail braking, steering input, we can get the car to rotate a bit and help the car get around the corner, faster than otherwise. Now, if we do too much of this, the car will tend to oversteer or even spin in a dramatic situation. On the other hand, if we don't have enough entry speed, the car will feel like it's on rails, and so it's not going to rotate. And I have to say, well, I should point out the steps here are: first, enough entry speed; second, kind of quick or crisp steering input; and then manage what happens with the brake release. And what I really want to point out is, this is something that takes more than a little practice, and not everyone is comfortable doing this. And many of us certainly aren't good at it. So if you're not, if you don't feel like you're ready for this, or you're not comfortable with it, don't feel bad. You're in good company. So this is a learned skill that many people need a coach to help with, to really figure out. So with all that said, let me summarize. Start, when you're thinking about braking, to remember the priorities, that you have to have the line figured out and watt figured out before you worry about the braking. So when you're thinking about braking, think about your accelerate 2 point, not the beginning of braking. Use a strong leg, that 1, 2 on the brake pedal once you do get on it. Experiment with how much trail, where the end of brake is, what your timing and rate of release of the brake pedal is. And if you do that, probably you're going to figure the rotation out anyway, but you can kind of think about that as an extra step if you choose. So I hope you found that useful. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or see me at the track. I'm always happy to get feedback and answer questions. And in particular, if you have any additional tips that have worked for you, that you have found useful to help you get better on track, I would love to hear about those. So with that, again, I look forward to seeing you at the track soon, and I hope you have a great day.